Hi everyone, it's Jenna McPhee here. I'm going to be talking with Peter Ashley again today, and he's going to be talking about the disbandment of the 84th Regiment and the settlement.
Thank you. When the American Revolutionary War ended, it ended with the Treaty of Paris signed on September 3rd, 1783. I don't want to sound like a history teacher, but that is when it ended officially. The Loyalist evacuation from the United States, the newly formed United States, actually was not completed until December of 1783. New York was the last stronghold of the British, and it took that amount of time. For the disbandment of many of the regiments, including the 2nd Battalion of the 84th Regiment, that occurred, the orders came down the line from the commanders that they be moved all to Fort Edward in Windsor, and they were to be disbanded on October 10th, 1783. The entire regiment or battalion, however, was not here in Nova Scotia. They did have to all come because one of the companies was in Fort Anne, for example, which is in Annapolis Royal. Another one was in Halifax. There were detachments in what was called Spanish River, which is now North Sydney. It took them, once they knew that they were going to be disbanded on October 10th, so they had that time to march to Windsor, to Fort Edward. It must have been pretty crowded because there was only 2 small barracks at Fort Edward and 1 officer's quarters. Some of the soldiers had to stay in huts that were located outside of the fort. Even then, not all of the companies were able to make it back in time for that October 10th disbandment. The Jamaica companies, there was 2 companies in Jamaica, they did not get back arrive here until October 23rd. So then they were disbanded. And the Newfoundland company left Newfoundland in time. They were going to go to New York first and then come to Nova Scotia to be disbanded, but their ship was blown off course, and it was blown off course all the way to the Caribbean. And so they ended up spending a year there because they had to make ship repairs and so on. And they did not, or not fully a year, and they did not make it back to Nova Scotia to be disbanded until April 1784. When the soldiers were disbanded, the orders came down that they were allowed to keep their entire uniform, including the weapons, their musket, their sword, and that is why, for example, original muskets have been found in East Hants, and at least 2 swords have been identified that belonged to soldiers in the 84th Regiment. They were then, the commander of the 2nd Battalion by that time, he was no longer Major Small, he was Lieutenant Colonel John Small. He was given a grant of, I made a mistake when I said in the flip chart that it was 84,500 acres. It was actually 81,500 acres. So the land grant consisted of what is now the Kennecook River, or half of the Kennecook River, the 9 Mile River, the full length of it, and the 5 Mile River. However, Colonel Small was not very good at getting things done, organized quickly. He left it to some of the junior officers, one of them being Lieutenant Hector McLean. And I'm going to read one of the things he wrote here on October 28th, which was only a couple weeks after their disbandment. He said, "I intend, if the weather is any ways tolerable, whenever it becomes so, to go to Kennecook, to get a hut built on the town lot I am to have there, and I will live there this winter. I mean to occupy myself in clearing and enclosing my great lot, which would be hundreds of acres, with all possible diligence after the lands are surveyed, etc. Then, on the 4th of November, 1783, he said, "I am at this moment returned from Kent Cook, and found your letter covering Mr. Beimer's receipt." Well, that's financial affairs. "I went no further than the place fixed for our town lot, where I met James Kalaki, which is James MacDonald, hard at work with a surveyor laying out the small lots. The men who had gone up there before I reached, amounting in all to 30, upwards exclusive of their respective families, left behind, waited till yesterday morning, then after drawing their several lots, to my great astonishment, they, to a man, packed up and prepared to march off back to Windsor. I endeavored to learn from them their intention, but I did not find it a matter so easy as one would naturally expect to collect their meaning, but a very few of them seemed to have any design or opinion of their own, and these few were determined to have nothing to do with the town lots. I attempted to expostulate. They were positive these little lots would ruin anyone who would settle on them, that no benefit could ever be reaped from them, for after expending their labor and provisions, and that they could not get on those farm lots till so late in the spring that it would be impossible to raise anything to live on for the ensuing year." When the men were left Windsor, within a month after the disbandment, they marched actually through the woods in their full uniform, fully armed. No wonder that the men were fed up after marching all that way through the forest and whatnot to see the area where their land grants were going to be. This is a statement by William Halliburton. He had claims of land that were located inside the 84th grant. And this is how he described the land. "Whoso explores the river, Kennecook River, will find one continuous forest whose antiquity seems to vie with creation, where the sun cannot enter till there is opened up a passage. Where is the man so hardy or so mad as to settle in such a horrid wild, so far from all human assistance, where nothing can be obtained at first except with infinite labor and difficulty, and through much suffering, and when obtained, of little value for lack of roads to market," which is the reason why settlement of that spot has not been attempted. So even though he had dreams, he was a wealthy lawyer from Windsor, had dreams of developing land here in East Hants. He obviously thought that the land was just incredibly difficult to possibly settle. If you can imagine, because nowadays so much of it has been subjected to the lumber industry and whatnot, but these soldiers marched through antique forests, and that did vie with creation. These trees were big enough that you wouldn't be able to put your arms around them. And they were given axes and saws, hand saws, to be able to cut these things down, clear land, try to plant crops, and many of them were very discouraged. It was very difficult land for these soldiers to try to even get through. There was no trails, there was no roads, so you couldn't even bring a horse, not that they had one. Only the officers would have had access to horses. Once they got out here in the Kennecook River area, the 5 Mile River area, the 9 Mile River area, the forest was just so dense that it was very discouraging. Many of them actually refused to accept their land grants. Some of them, even once they got their land grant, There was a number of them, including George Miller and two of his compatriots from the American Army, who were also in the 84th Regiment. They got a land grant in roughly where West Gore is, but it was terrible, terrible land, and they ended up being so disappointed by it, all of them sold their lots. They sold them to William Smith, who was a prominent citizen in the area. And George Miller and his wife and one child that he had actually moved to Halifax with the intent to go back to Pennsylvania until he was advised that to do so might cause him to be hanged as a traitor. Lieutenant Hector McLean, the one who I already spoke about, he was probably the one who actually convinced George Miller to stay, and that he would get him a 500-acre grant on the Kennecook River, roughly where Upper Kennecook is now. And that's where fellow German, Pennsylvania German, 84th members like Louis Ettinger and Christian Henniger also got their land grants. So for him, that made much more sense, and that's where he ended up settling. He didn't get the 500 acres, but he did get 400 acres. So it took a long time. All these settlers from the 84th Regiment to occupy their lands, to clear it, and then in 1798 it was all escheated by the government. And escheated means it was all taken back. So the reason being that it was not, the conditions of the land grants were not being met. And that was largely Lieutenant Colonel John Small's fault. He was set up with a 2,000-acre grant here in Selma, which was fine for him, but it wasn't fine for the soldiers. Eventually, he went back to the United Kingdom. He was given he was raised in his rank to a major general, and he was appointed as a governor of the Isle of Guernsey in the English Channel. So he didn't really stick around to help out his soldiers. It was all the work that was done to help them actually get settled was Lieutenant Hector McLean, who was the main officer who did stay here. He did settle here, and he made sure that he kept applying to government that something be done to ensure that all the 84th soldiers got their land grants. So in 1800, you know, by the time some of these soldiers were getting up there in years, by 1800, a commission was appointed by the Nova Scotia government to come to Douglas Township and find out who had claims to what land. Many of them had already begun clearing and settling. So that commission reported in 1800 to the government, and it wasn't until the very last land grants were confirmed to soldiers of the 84th Regiment in 1816. That's a long time after what they were promised that they would get that land grant.